Richard Vague started working at a bank to pay the bills while he went to college at the University of Texas at Austin. And let's just say that that bank made quite an investment in his career. Hi, I'm Dave Price, and this is the American Farmland Owner Podcast. Richard can explain how that bank job ended up being so important to his career. That career has taken him through the banking industry, leading several companies, and even traveling the country for a while as he considered a run for president. A theme throughout all of this has been the impact of debt and risk and what Richard learned from both of those. Let's begin the conversation with how he started out. Let's start to tell us a little about yourself. How'd you get to where you are?
Well, it's great to be with you, and I really appreciate your time. I've spent most of my career in banking, even though towards the end of my career, I branched out into energy and then into venture capital. So a little of this and a little of that.
It all adds up, right?
Yep.
All right, so what's exciting about the banking industry? Why'd you dive into that?
Well, I wish I had some great story there. I was trying to put myself through school, went around knocking on doors and trying to get a job to pay for class. And next thing you know, I was president of the bank. So it was a little bit inadvertent.
Okay, I'm going to think there were a few steps before some guy's walking around trying to pay his way through school and all of a sudden became a bank president. I think you may have skipped through a few steps.
You know, I was getting a degree in marketing and advertising from the University of Texas at Austin and working part-time at the bank, literally to put myself through school and writing, doing this, that, and the other. And I mean, like the day I graduated, the president, who I didn't really know, called me in and asked me if I'd like to be head of the marketing and advertising department of the bank. So that was a big break in my career. And then I got into operations, and over time, probably maybe what was it? No, actually, probably like about 8 or 9 years later, I was president of the bank. So
there you go. All right, talk about venture capitalism. How'd you foray into that?
Well, I started and eventually sold 3 businesses. One was, after my banking career that I just mentioned, we started a new bank from scratch. And then we started an energy company after that. So we've started and sold a lot of businesses and had great fortune and had a little capital to invest ourselves. And I didn't want at that point in my career want to get back into full-time operations of a business, but I wanted to keep my hand in business. And since I felt like I knew a lot about starting a business and eventually selling it, we started to get involved in our local startup community, and we've spent, maybe, a little over 10 years now, and had a great deal of success. Kept energized and enthused because, as you know, being around new ideas and younger people will do that to you, and have enjoyed that.
I'm wondering if it's a blessing and a curse, your background, when you're in this startup community, because you know what it's like to sit in that corner office of a lending institution and have to decide, this sounds like a pretty decent idea. We're going to risk our resources into this, or no, this one's not jiving for me.
Well, you've defined the equation, and and there's a lot more of that in venture capital than there is in banking. I mean, in banking, you're not supposed to be doing too much of that. You're supposed to be taking a business with predictable cash flow and
sure,
financing, working capital or what have you. And in venture capital, you're rolling the dice, and so there, you're in a much earlier stage in the life of the company, and so your need to assess ideas was at a premium in venture capital in a way it's not in banking.
So how do you assess that, whether a project's got potential?
Well, you're talking about one of the harder things one could do. And I'm always reminded there's a famous writer named William Goldman, who was in Hollywood and was well known for a number of fabulous movies. And he made the statement, you know, nobody knows anything. And he said, most producers in Hollywood, if they had declined all the scripts they greenlighted and greenlighted all the scripts they declined, would probably have ended up in just about the same place than they would have otherwise. And I've thought about that many times in the venture capital business, because the failure rate by design is pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
So you do your best in assessing the idea. You do your best in assessing how large the market is, which is a big factor. If you don't have a big market, how can you have a big success? And then you spend most of your time trying to assess the management. Are these guys that can move mountains? Do they have high energy? So I think a lot of it boils down to assessing the management team.
Do you have to? I'm thinking of some of the TV shows I've seen, like Shark Tank or something, you get, especially when somebody comes out there and has a real engaging, likable personality. Do you have to separate that? And being a good person's great, right? And a nice attribute, but the bottom line's the bottom line. So do you have to separate those things, or does the character piece fit into this equation too?
Well, I mean, you raise an extremely important point. There's a lot of folks that, to use the phrase, they interview well. And I've known, I'm sure and I'm sure the audience knows, there's a whole lot of people that interview well that aren't able to actually do anything.
Sure.
So, a lot of the assessment.
We elect some of them into office.
We elect most of them into office, best I can tell. So, I think a whole lot of it is not how glib they are in presenting, but the reference checking you do on them, the things they've done previously in their career. You looking for, and we actually did, and I've done this in my businesses as well. We actually do a little bit of psychological profiling, testing, and so forth. So, you try not to be faked out by, the dazzle in the meeting, and try to really get underneath it and assess the substance.
Well, for those of us who do not have any dazzle, it just makes us work harder.
I don't know. I'm getting a lot of dazzle right here during this interview. So
Ooh, you got to put some glasses on. I'm afraid you're falling for this one. You need to do a profile of me, I think. Hey, I made a joke about politics, but you look through your bio, and you've been about every corner of the room. You've been a Republican, you've been an independent, you've been a Democrat. What the heck?
Well, I don't line up particularly well with either party.
Okay.
And it's not today, not in the past.
Okay.
I grew up in a Republican household. I got kind of enlisted as part of a Democratic governor's administration as Secretary of Banking there for a couple of years.
In Pennsylvania, right?
In Pennsylvania. And so, yeah, I have seen it. But if you put down all the ideas that I have about what we ought to be doing in this country, they don't really line up with either party particularly well.
But it's interesting, though, when you say that. I was just having a conversation with somebody earlier in the week, and I was thinking, what if you got a bunch of smart people in a room and a piece of paper, do this old school, and start writing ideas down, regardless of political connections to it and philosophies? This, and this. I mean, you could probably make. We remember David Letterman used to have a top 10 list on his late night comedy show, but you do a top 10 list. I would think that smart people could come up with 10 things that the bulk of our population could go for. Now, the two major political parties probably wouldn't go for it because they wouldn't get enough credit, and they would have to give, and too much give and take with all of this. But with a lot of things, it seems like you can kind of build a consensus on certain things regardless of party, don't you think?
Well, I'll agree with you and go a step further.
Okay.
We actually did this about 3 years ago. I took it upon myself to go around the country in a very structured way and talk to voters, middle class voters, kind of 50 to $150,000 annual
And you were
income.
thinking about running for president, right, at the time?
That came out of this experience. But
Okay,
um, we talked to folks that were Democrat, Republican, and independent. We went to 15 different states. We spent time in Iowa and New Hampshire, as everybody does, but
sure.
we're in Nevada and South Carolina and Florida and Texas and Illinois and Michigan and what have you. And the real surprise to me, it was quite a surprise to me, was that folks' issues were the same no matter which party they were in and no matter which state I was in.
Hmm.
So, I think that reinforces the point you made. And most of the issues, if not all of the issues, really boil down to their daily lives, making ends meet,
Hmm.
taking care of their kids, the very practical stuff that immediately impacted their daily lives, their health insurance, their ability to get a job, their folks in their family that were struggling with addiction. It was a really short list and it was it was the same everywhere we went. But I think the way that parties are structured, the fringe element of both parties really drives the bus, so to speak. It's not mainstream Republicans that drive the agenda of the Republican Party. It's the folks out on the edge, and same within the Democratic Party. The many of the ideas that get prominence within the Democratic Party, I can't find anybody who supports them that I know. And and I have seen many folks. I just sat down at the request of a friend here in Philly, who's a very wealthy individual who's kind of finished with his career, a magnificent career, and wanted to, try to do something in politics, and pretty much articulated exactly what you just said. Like, can't we just find a common sense middle and do that? And I told him, you know, you're going to be a grain of sand on the beach when you go to Washington D.C. It's the only the fringe of both parties are sufficiently energized to really make things happen in primaries. The the middle is more content and less likely to be, out
The
there trying to
loudest
make things
voice.
happen there. Yep.
Yeah, and you can see, and it feels like each cycle, perhaps this gets even more pronounced, but what it takes for these candidates to get through the primary process to get to the nomination, that then further alienates them from that bigger kind of core center that I'm counting that, straddles both Democrats and Republicans, because that middle, you can argue maybe, who knows, 60, 70% really of the population when you start looking at some of these issues you're talking about.
I
And
think that's exactly right.
okay, so you've got some ideas when it comes to taxes. And before we get into that, one of the things that I guess I wanted to ask you about, in light of some of the things you're saying, is do you think as we're moving forward, and I appreciate you went through this, so you're traveled around 15 states, talked to tons of people, you kind of dipped your toe in there a little bit about, do I want to run? Do I not want to run? And going through that experience and then kind of looking at the aftermath of everything that the country's been dealing with the last several years in particular, do you feel that much of the change that we are going to need to fix stuff is not going to come from politicians? Like, are we to a level where they are so strongly focused on getting into the majority, holding on to power, and if they're not in the majority, getting to the majority, getting out of the minority? So it's not really this atmosphere of, okay, one party controls the House, let's say, one controls the Senate, and then whatever the president is, and you got to figure it out. You do your negotiating like they used to do, and something happens, right? A lot of give and take. Are we to the point now where it's just so polarized that they're not going to fix big stuff, and it's going to have to somehow come from elsewhere? Is that a too sad, cynical view?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'll agree with you and maybe take it a step further. the U.S. governmental system is not designed to get things done. It's designed to slow things down and prevent things from getting done. You know, I'm actually writing a book about this right now. That, you know, right after the Declaration of Independence and the War of Independence, all the states had to set up their own state government. This is 11 years before the Constitution. So we had a decade or a little more where states reigned supreme with their own constitutions. And Pennsylvania's constitution was uh, extremely democratic. There was no upper house or Senate equivalent. It was just what we think of as the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
They were elected annually. There was no governor with a veto power. They created a relatively toothless Supreme Executive Council. Judges were not appointed. They were elected, again, to be very responsive to the people.
Mm-hmm.
And folks thought that was dangerously democratic because they could get a lot of things done, and it was extremely responsive to the people. So when they crafted the Constitution, they actually tried to get rid of a lot of that responsiveness and that democracy. So they put in place a Senate with 6-year terms that was not elected by the people. They were elected by state legislators, as you recall. They didn't want the president to be elected by the people. They created this artifice we know of the Electoral College. They didn't want judges to be elected by the people. And by the way, judges were agents of creditors and landlords, by the way. They were courts in those days, not too different than today, were enforcement mechanisms of the elite, you know, and so they didn't want judges elected. They wanted judges appointed, and to make damn sure they wanted them appointed for life. That makes it about as unresponsive to democracy as you can possibly make a judge.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, they ended up with an apparatus that was intentionally designed to tamp down on democracy and responsiveness. So, hell yeah, I agree with you. You know, and I would say that when I look at history, I wrote a business history of the United States a few years ago, which caused me to have to go through, you know, each decade over 250 years and really understand what's going on. Most of the things that have happened that have really been transformative in this country have happened in spite of government, or, you know, with the powers, the business powers that were in effect in power at that time, influencing the government, you know, in the old fashioned way, you know, with money and influence and things like that. So I would say absolutely yes. I think the things that happen in this country often are government responding to initiatives that happen outside, you know, be they social movements or business movements or all of the above.
Okay, so in January you're coming to Des Moines. What are you gonna be talking about? What are you trying to get across to people? I mean, you know, we can't give every part of the speech away here, but what kind of theme are you talking about? What do you want people walking away talking about?
Well, I've been in conversation with the good folks that invited me about that very thing, and I think there's some flexibility. But I wrote a book. My most recent book was called The Paradox of Debt, which really talks about a debt. And, you know, most folks, when they think about debt, think about government debt, and really that's the lesser part of the equation. And the much bigger part of the equation that almost never gets talked about is private sector debt and trends in private sector debt. And I think those are determinative in terms of our economy. If you really want to understand what's going to happen in the economy and what has happened in the economy, you should spend a lot of time looking and studying, thinking about private sector debt. And, you know, it explains a lot of things that have happened in the past, like the global financial crisis. And, you know, explains what's going on in China right now. And China's about to implode, as you know.
Hmm.
and so forth. So a lot of it may be in and around that. And that book goes on to talk about wealth creation and some things like that. So I don't know how much of that to cover or not, but we'll figure that out between now and then.
So it's interesting you talk about that because, when we were talking about the government and kind of the failures of government, but one of the things that has kind of baffled me, honestly, is that as the federal debt is about $35 trillion, which is just a stupid number, right? Like, I mean, like that's just not a number most of us can process because it's just so stinking big. But it feels like there's no mandate from the people to do anything. And we get, as I cynically was talking about, politicians seem focused on getting to the majority and then staying in the majority. They're not willing to take on the big drivers of debt, right? I mean, it's a lot cooler to tell you, hey, I'm going to cut your taxes. I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to give you this program. I'm going to do that. I mean, it's awesome, right? We don't have to give up anything. We just put everything on the credit card. With international spending, whatever the heck it is, and we just watch this thing skyrocket to where just compared to 10 years ago, it's nothing like it was. So, but you think private sector is a bigger concern than our public debt?
By far.
Okay.
So let me just throw one little number out there for you that might put that 35 trillion in perspective for you.
Okay.
What do you think the net worth of households is?
Ooh.
Assets minus liabilities. What do you think the net worth of households is?
This is where I need to phone a friend or pick up my phone and do
I'm
a
not
quick Google. I
sure
don't know.
you could find a friend that knows this number.
Probably not. What is it?
$160 trillion.
Ooh. Okay.
And you know what a big part of that is? That wealth is? The
What's
U.S.
that?
Treasury securities they hold. Income equals expense.
Hmm.
When the government spends money, it doesn't disappear.
Right.
They don't take it out and back and burn it.
Right.
It goes into somebody's bank account. And the somebody's bank account that it goes into is U.S. households. And if the U.S. if the government didn't have $35 trillion in debt, the net worth of U.S. households would be what? 125 trillion. It'd be 35 trillion smaller than it is.
So
So
that would make me think you're not that worried about the federal debt.
I'm not, Japan's is 250% of GDP. Ours
Yeah,
is, measly 120%. I'm being facetious there,
sure. Yeah, yeah.
but here's another little stat for you. Over the course of the pandemic, the 3 years of 2021 and 22, and by the way, I'm not making these numbers up. The Federal Reserve publishes these once a quarter. So anybody can go do this analysis, and it ain't complicated. In the 3 years of the pandemic, federal debt increased by $8 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
That's the number you were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to household net worth during that same 3-year period? Would you guess?
Mm. How much?
Went up by $30 trillion.
Mm.
$8 trillion went straight into the checking accounts of households.
Mm-hmm.
And the profusion of debt actually pushes up asset values. One of the correlations that folks tend not to think about is the more debt there is, the higher real estate and stock prices go. And that's an intuitive concept when you think about trying to sell your own house. If you have 10 folks that are qualified by their lenders to buy your house, you're going to get a better price than if there's only one or zero.
Mm-hmm.
The more debt there is, the higher. And by the way, you can also go plot that and see whether that's true or not. But the two biggest household assets there are stocks and real estate. And those are both positively impacted by increases in debt. So what happened was the proliferation of debt pushed up asset values. Did you notice that house prices, stock prices went up during the
Yeah.
pandemic?
Yeah, like
You know?
crazy.
That was the proliferation of debt. And with the money the government spent, the 8 trillion went straight into household checking accounts, and the other 22 trillion was the increase in stock and real estate values. So if you're going to ask me to worry about government debt, you're going to have to show me an example of something that happened somewhere that would cause me to be worried about it. I'm an empiricist. You get the data out. Let's look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And my suspicion is that most folks never really looked at the data. And don't look at just the government. We got this massive country. So if we're going to do a balance sheet analysis of the country, let's do the government, households, financial institutions, non-financial corporations. There's too little flies in the ointment there. And they're real flies. One of them is almost all that wealth goes to the top 10% households.
Right.
I mean, the skew of wealth in our country is profound. The bottom 60% of households have about 15% of the household wealth. And the top 10% have 70%. So when houses and stock prices go up, the top 10% are the winners, and the middle class doesn't feel much of it one way or the other. So that's one big fly in the ointment. The other fly in the ointment that I don't think gets enough attention is our trade deficit. That really is an issue, and that's an issue that's kind of been swept under the rug. But our trade deficit was, for most of this country's history, our trade deficit was 0 or 1%. On a bad year, it was 1%. A good year was plus 1%. It's been bouncing around at -3, 4, 5, 6%, really since the 80s. And, that means we're incurring debt. And I'm not talking about we, the government. I'm talking about you and me when we buy a Mercedes or when we buy, electronic component from, frankly, when we buy an iPhone, because a lot of that goes to the assemblers in China. So, that's something that I do have concern about and wish we'd do something about. It's not an easy thing. But the government deficit, is not in my top 5 or 10 things to worry about.
So if we're looking to address any of that under that line of thinking, should we look at foreign aid then, so that has no direct impact on our wealth within our border?
Are you saying should we do less foreign aid?
I am. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of a lot of foreign aid.
Okay.
I think I'm a little selfish in that regard. I think there's plenty of things that need aid right here in little old United States of America. That
Right.
if I had my checkbook out, I'd write it to fix I ride the Acela every day. This is this
Mm-hmm.
supposed great train
Yeah.
that goes between DC and Boston. And man, oh man, is it compared to, I'd spend a little doing fixing that. I think there's a few airports need to be fixing. I think some roads and bridges need to be fixing, So I'm not sure that I'd do what the government does with it, but that's not my decision.
Okay, so when you're let's take this to the farmland space. So as you're looking at private debt, is debt for a farm operation that good or bad?
I think debt is something that requires a lot of caution. I think leverage levels are ones you need to keep in check. A little bit of debt is a good thing. Your leverage can help a business grow. It can help a household acquire a house or something like that. But I think it's something we ought to be awfully cautious about. And I'll tell you, one of the most poignant memories I have is, I guess, about 3-4 years ago now. We were in Iowa and we were with a group of dairy farmers. My wife was with me, and she and I still talk about this. And these folks were dealing with a collapse in milk prices.
Mm-hmm.
And so we just listened, what happened, how it happened. And the basic story came out. And this is a story that's been repeated 1,000 times in 1,000 contexts. with things that don't have anything to do with milk. But in this case, it had to do with milk. And that is when milk prices rose, their bankers came to them and said, why don't you acquire more land so you can produce more milk to take advantage of these prices?
Mm-hmm.
And guess what happened when they expanded and started producing more milk on land they'd bought with debt? What happened to prices?
They went the wrong way.
They went down, and they're sitting there stuck with this. Unlike prior times, there's a secular downward trend in the amount of milk Americans are drinking. We know we're
Right.
drinking almond milk and this, that, and the other, which they call nut juice, by the way.
Yeah.
They said there ought to be a law that bans the almond industry from using the term milk. At any rate, they're sitting there, with a secular decline in the amount of milk folks are drinking. They've just expanded with debt and prices are collapsing. Folks were having to sell their cows and get out of the business altogether.
Mm-hmm.
I'm telling you, that stuck with Laura and I. It broke our hearts. But that's a story that's been told 1,000 times in 1,000 places. Prices are going up. Let's borrow more and be more aggressive.
Right.
So debt's a two-edged sword.
So how do you convince people to resist that temptation, no matter what they're producing on that farm? If they're seeing prices going up, then that, for a lot of people, that's probably pretty logical, right? You're like, heck yeah, let's go. Let's expand what we're doing and make even more. I mean, how do you get people to resist that? Because in some cases, it may keep going.
Well, I don't know of any commodity price that's ever kept going.
Well, probably not commodity. Yeah, good point.
So, I got to tell you, I think the fact that there's not a lot of attention paid to private debt as a topic in macroeconomics is part of the issue. You almost never see an economist get on the TV or whatever and talk about. They're all lamenting about government debt. Well, the government's going to be able to pay its debt, in case you hadn't noticed.
Right.
And but private sector is not. And I mean, this is exactly what happened in 08. And really it's from about 05 to about 07, really.
Mm-hmm.
Is folks, oh my God, housing prices are going up. Let's build more houses. Our unsold housing inventory went from, a normalized level, even today, would be about 2 million unsold homes, which I think is one of the most important economic statistics you could look at to determine where things are headed. We got it up to 4 million unsold homes in 07. How'd we miss that? Mortgage debt went from 5 trillion to 10 trillion, from 5 trillion to 10 trillion in about 4 years. Who missed that?
Yeah.
How is it possible to even miss that?
But all the builders at the time were looking at it like, let's go. There's a lot of money out there to be made.
And by the way, what I spent 40 years of my career in banking, and I can tell you, the time when businesses borrow is when lenders are lending. That's about the extent of the analysis. I can get a loan, so I'm going to get one.
Yep.
And when I can't get one, I'm not going to get a loan. So,
Man, I remember in college when I qualified for financial aid, you sit down and it was a mixture of grants, and because our family didn't have a lot of money, so I qualified for some grants and some loans, and all right, here's what you're eligible for. And I thought, all right, that was for grad school. And I was living with 2 roommates who came from money. They didn't have a job. And I thought, I'm going to take what they're giving me here. So I quit my little
rich.
My little serving job at a restaurant, and I thought, I'm going to live like they do. And I did for a couple months. And then, you graduate and those bills come due.
That's funny how that works.
And back then, I can remember it well. Those loans were 8.25%. And when you're making minimum payments, it takes you a while to chip away at that.
A lot of folks can barely pay the interest on that, much less reduce the principal. So, yeah.
So how do you convince people to pay more attention to this private sector debt?
Well, and my little world, I mean, it's a giant world out there, and I'm
Hmm.
just one person,
Hmm.
but I've written a whole lot on it. And I've published a number of books about it, and I have a blog and a video and so
Hmm.
forth and so on. So, and there's others. I'm not alone that have come to this conclusion, but it's one of those things. It's like, how do you how do you teach folks to drink less soda so they have less sugar, and
Yeah.
how do you teach folks to exercise more, and it's just one of those things.
Now I was told you got some ideas about taxes. Is that something you're chewing on too?
Well, yeah, it probably is this. I've been asked by our mayor here in Philadelphia to um, uh, chair a tax reform commission. I
Hmm.
have a gentleman who's my co-chair, and it's not a difficult equation in a major urban city. Our taxes are so high that businesses of any consequence move to the suburbs to avoid the tax. So that's about as complicated as it gets here. We got to figure out a way to convince our city to kind of gradually reduce taxes, and I think we'll have some success.
There's something that's been going on in the state of Iowa when it comes to income taxes, and it's been more gradual. Republicans have been in charge of the state, both chambers of the legislature and the governor since 2017. So we're now, what, 7 years into it, and they had looked at what Kansas did in cutting taxes, kind of as a warning, hey, don't do too much too fast. So they've done these gradual reductions, and they've been reduced enough to where projected revenues will be smaller in the year ahead than the current year. Is that something that, as you're kind of looking at for specifically Philadelphia, but it has to be a gradual process?
Oh,
And
absolutely. It's what the federal government has the luxury, of running deficits, but
mhm.
states and local governments don't have that luxury.
But how
In
do you
many
do it
cases,
when it's gradual though? Because that's not sexy, right? Like, it's a lot sexier to be, all right, we're right here and we're bam, we're cutting it way down.
you're right, and I think didn't somebody over in England do that, make that same mistake, and was out of office, I think, in 48 days or something like that. So, and the guy in Kansas, was that Brownback, or I'm trying to remember.
He was out in Kansas. Yeah, he ran for president. I remember too, through the state of Iowa.
No, I think in any large scale operation, doing something gradually is probably the better way to go. And it's funny. Time passes pretty quickly. If you do a
Hmm.
little bit a year and stick with it, you know, before you know it, you've accomplished something. And in our case, one of the things we'll do, we have a magnificent genetic engineering, biotech, life sciences industry here in Philly because of some of the discoveries that have been made at the University of Pennsylvania. And they're spinning off businesses. They come up with IP, go find some capital, and next thing you know, we got a business with a few hundred employees. And
Hmm.
um, I think our obligation in Philly is to try to keep that here rather than let it go to Boston or San Francisco or the
Sure.
suburbs or wherever. So what we're going to recommend, I don't know if it'll be accepted or not, is taking some slice of the tax cut and putting it in a pot that you use to do workforce development and economic development and capital for small businesses and things like that. So we hope to play offense instead of just play defense.
Kind of build the wealth, build out. I grew up in the St. Louis area, on the Illinois side of the river, but St. Louis area, and the city of St. Louis got this huge settlement from the owner of the Rams National Football League team after it had moved back to LA. And they got 600, $700 million, whatever the heck the settlement was. And it's kind of just been sitting there because the city and community leaders haven't been able to figure out what to do with it. And part of it is, they have so many needs, where do you start? When I was a kid, the city probably had 1 million residents and it may have 400,000 or whatever it is now. And some of the things you talked about in Philly, that part of you had residents who left the city for the suburbs, you had businesses that left the city for the suburbs for a variety of reasons. What was left, you got decayed buildings, you got crime that people are worried about, schools have suffered, I mean, all kinds of stuff, but they have to figure out how to build it out locally now, and they've got a really good chunk of money, and they got to figure out, are you going to do a little bit over time, and what priorities get that, or do you do these massive investments?
And more often than not, a lot of it gets, what's the expression that's repeatable on a podcast? Pissed away.
Yeah, let's say squandered. Yes, exactly.
Squandered. That's the word I was looking for.
We're family friendly here, so we're going to go with squandered. Hey, we appreciate the conversation. Thanks for your insight, and look forward to catching up with you when you come to Des Moines in January.
Well, I really look forward to seeing you in person.
Bring your boots, bring something warm, because it ain't warm here in January.
Well, I like cold weather.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
He is Richard Vague, author, YouTube creator, traveling speaker, banking executive. Richard will serve as the keynote speaker at the 2025 18th Annual Land Investment Expo in Des Moines, Iowa on January the 14th. American Farmland Owner is a media sponsor of that event, by the way. Now, you can learn more about Richard's career and the Land Expo by checking out our profile piece about Richard in the weekly American Farmland Owner newsletter. Just head to AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Check it out. You can also sign up for this free weekly newsletter if you haven't already done it. You can also check out that Land Expo while you're there too. Thanks for listening, and thanks for caring about the future of our farmers.